Today I'm going to take you on a little tour of the history of Barry, from when it was actually an island, and a holy island at that, to now when, hopefully, we're firmly attached to the mainland. 1,500 years in 10 minutes. I must be mad! But I'm going to take you back now to the 5th century. At that time, Barry Island was a bleak, desolate island inhabited by a colony of rabbits and very little else. By that time, a Benedictine monk called Piero visited the island, and he set up a colony of monks on the island, and the island was named after him. So today, we could very well be sitting in Anis Piero, which is what it was originally called, if it wasn't for the fact of yet another monk, Saint Barak. Now, have anybody heard of Saint Barak? Yes, excellent. Then some of you will know the following story. Because the story goes that Saint Barak was a follower of Saint Caddick. They lived on Flatholm, and as this was a holy island, they journeyed to the island. But unfortunately for Barak, he forgot to pack his master's holy book. This his master realized when they arrived on the island. But Caddick apparently flew into an unholy rage, and he sent Barak back to Flatholm to retrieve the book. Now, the Bristol Channel is not a great place in bad weather, especially not in a small boat. And sadly, Barak never returned to the island. He was drowned. A few hours later, he was washed up on Whitmore Bay. And there was no sign, he's not there now, there was no sign of his master's holy book. Now, I'm sure Caddick was distraught at this event, but it seems that his attention soon turned to his stomach as he sent his followers on a fishing trip. And it was on that fishing trip that his followers found a giant salmon washed up on the beach. When they cut open the salmon, inside the salmon, lodged in its stomach, was their master's holy book, completely undamaged. Now, with all the religious activity around the island at the time, and with the story of Saint Barak and the giant salmon, Barry, or Anis Piero as it was originally called, was firmly set in the minds of the people of the Middle Ages. And again, the island was renamed to Barry. So that's how it's got its name. But despite Barry Island's early religious history, Barry has a rather darker side. For the Vikings visited this island, although visited might not be quite the right terminology. So they set up, in 1087, they set up a raiding base on the island, and they used this as their base to plunder the mainland. If we jump a few years forward, into the 1700s, when the island was used by smugglers. Mr. Thomas Knight was a smuggler, and he arrived on the island supposedly on a 24-gun brig called the John O'Combe. And him and his followers barricaded and fortified the island, and they used the island as their base for smuggling. That was in 1783. Now, the authorities had some difficulty evicting him from the island. But when they finally managed it in 1785, he was replaced by one William Arthur, another smuggler. And after him, there was even more smugglers. Now, despite all this activity, by the 1800s, the island was abandoned again. A wild, desolate place, inhabited again by rabbits. They play a big part in Barry's history. But moving on to the 1900s. Now, between this period, Barry Island must have received many visitors, because in the late 19th century, an archaeological expedition to the island, hard word, discovered that there was over 7,000 bodies interred on the island. all of which must have been carried across to the island. Again, in the 19th century, the island, and it was still an island, was privately owned, and it passed through many different hands, eventually landing up in the hands of one Francis Crochet. And it was at this time that the island appeared on the maps of the Victorian day trippers. There are records of many trips being taken to the island. In 1850, a group of archaeologists, I got it right that time, went to the island. And that was organised by the Cardiff YMCA. Sunday school picnic in 1871. And the Cambrian Engine and Tugboat Works outing in 1873. There was even records of the time of people going into the sea and bathing. Can you imagine such a thing? The disgrace of it. But it was becoming a popular island. At that time, it was recorded that people even started living on the island. But this was despite the fact that you could only access the island by foot at low tide. In 1881, 85 people lived on the island. The place was positively booming. 85 people. Oops, losing my wire. But in 1884, that's when Barry Island really started coming to its own. That's when they built the Great Docks. The navvies built 2 massive dams at each end of the channel. They drained the channel, they dug out the channel, and all the material that they got out of the channel, they used to level off the ground around Barry Docks. Barry Island was no longer an island. Now, remarkably, in 1909, there was between 8,000 and 10,000 men working at Barry Docks. Barry Docks was the busiest coal exporting port in the world. Can you imagine that? Little Barry Island. But moving back to the population. I mentioned in 1881 there was 85 people living on Barry Island. Over the next 20 years, that figure increased to 27,000 people. By the eve of the First World War, there were almost 40,000 people living in Barry. It's a lot of people. But Barry really took off in 1896 when the National Railway opened and extended into Barry. That opened up Barry to people from all over the country. In the 20th century, the island passed from private hands to council hands. Massive investment was made, and Barry Island Fairground moved from the beach to where it is today. The first tenants of the fairground were the White family, and they ran it until the end of the 1929 season. Then the Collins family took it over. In 1939, there was a large roller coaster built there, the Scenic Railway roller coaster. At that time, it stood 72 feet high. It was the largest wooden roller coaster ever built in the UK at that time, all for little Barry Island. But during the 1920s and the 1930s, during the bank holiday periods, it was recorded that around 80 to 100,000 people would descend into Barry Island. The Second World War, after that, Barry Island really came into its own and went from strength to strength. One bank holiday, August bank holiday in 1950, got an audience, in 1950, it was recorded there was 120,000 people on Barry Beach. Can you imagine being sat on that at the front and getting up going for an ice cream? I think I'll leave it. Yeah? But it was a very, very popular place. Am I coming up with time? Okay. we'll move to the 1960s. Now, mid-1960s, so Barry Butlins open up, which brought even more people into Barry. And as a child, I remember holidaying at Barry Butlins. And for me, it was the highlight of the year. There was no flying off to Spain at the time. That really was the highlight of a holiday. But why did Barry receive such great success as opposed to Porthcawl, Penarth? Some would say that they are much prettier places. And from the research that I've looked at and the statements at the time, it seems quite obvious. You see, day trippers, when they went to these other resorts, they received rather a cold reception. Yet when they came to Barry, they were welcomed with open arms. So in my view, the success of Barry Island is down to the warm-hearted nature of the people of Barry. Thank you.